Hello, Christian.
Hi, Alessa.
Thanks for joining us today. So our learners have some questions to you. And the first would be about business models. So we have learned about business models and circularity indicators a bit this week. And you were also mentioning in your lectures the importance of business models to support recycling. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, sure. And indeed, business models for me is one of the keys to improve the overall recycling situation. You certainly recall that in the lecture I emphasized that the biggest challenge often is a collection step, and both in terms of creating volumes, but of course also cost-wise. It's usually the biggest cost impact factor. So any business model which addresses more and easier collection is a big step forward. And then there are a number of different choices to do this. And of course, probably the best known approach are deposit systems. We know this from beverage cans, for example, or from other some other devices. So far, this has not been common for electronic items, but in the lecture, I gave the specific case of smartphones and tablets, and from my personal opinion, deposit systems would be a good approach here. Why? Because a deposit system helps to bridge this important but also their high cost last mile, so from the consumer to a retail shop or to a network provider. So if there is a deposit system, then you and me have a clear incentive to bring back our old devices to the shop. Of course, there could be other incentives. This can be all kind of vouchers, of discounts, events, and so on. The important point is we need incentives which liberate the old devices from the household and bring it to a collection point. Important is that this collection point must be a very professional collection point. Important is also that although collection is key, of course, it's not the end of recycling. So after collection, there needs to be a security that the collected items are either highly professional repaired or recycled. So setting up such systems, deposit systems or other incentives needs to be followed also by some kind of supervising that everything is going in the right direction. On the mid and long term, an even much better approach than deposit systems or similar monetary incentives would be a really rather radical change in the business model, and this would be a leasing system, which means you don't buy your smartphone, you don't buy your tablet computer, but you buy the service of using it. And as long as you use it, you pay your lease rate, which means that if you don't use it anymore, it's not so probable that you keep it in your drawer for ages, because then you continue paying for something which you don't use anymore. The second big advantage of such a lease model, especially if it's a cascade lease model, is that it has an inherent incentive for the producer to lease out items which build in longevity, which are easier to repair, which are easier to recycle, because in the end it makes for him the business more profitable. And in the case of a smartphone, for example, a cascade lease, a so-called cascade lease, could be an option, which means there are always people who are very keen to have the latest model. And if 1 year later a new model is coming on the market, they want to have this again. So they are willing to pay a relatively high price if they buy a phone, or also a relatively high lease rate. But when they return it, a 1-year-old phone or 1.5-year-old phone, of course, this is nothing which should be recycled immediately. This can be used a second time and a third time. So if this is returned to the shop, it can be, it can be checked. There can be, of course, a very professional data deletion of data, maybe a software update. And then at a lower lease rate, it could go into a second cycle and in a third cycle and so on. At the end, and this is important if we have such kind of lease models, these lease models really have to be used to the very end, so to the end of life. And then again, the lessee takes it back, and then he enters directly in a contract with a recycler. And the advantage is that at this stage, then he has a critical mass. So it's attractive also for a recycler to get these materials. And it's a relatively homogeneous materials. You don't have this big mess if you return a smartphone to a municipal collection point. Smartphones are mixed with electric toothbrushes and toasters and all these things, which makes recycling extremely difficult. But in such a case, you just would have, for example, smartphones even of a certain brand, which is a perfect condition for entering into high quality repair or high quality recycling.
Thanks. Another question that came up was about extended producer responsibility. So the question is, who should be responsible actually that products enter the recycling stream?
Yeah. No, also important question. What we should avoid is playing the blame game. So it's not me who is responsible, it's you who is responsible, and so on. I think in principle, it's a kind of joint responsibility. Everybody has to play his role or her role. But of course, it should not mean that if it's joint, I just point out then to another person. So let's start with the consumer. I think that the consumer has a kind of ethical or moral obligation to hand in end-of-life devices into recycling chains. He should also have a motivation to hand it into proper recycling chain and not through any dubious channels. On the other side, also retail shops, the distributors have an obligation. They have to learn that it's not a one-way street just to sell devices. There also is a responsibility of the one who distributes it to the market to take it back or to contribute, that it's at the end of life taken back in a professional way. Of course, we have the legislator to set appropriate frame conditions. And then, and this is in the core of the word, of course, the producer itself, because producer responsibility or extended producer responsibility, it's about the producer. And for example, for electronics, but also for end-of-life vehicles and so on, today there are producer responsibilities or also so-called extended producer responsibilities, but the way they are organized today don't function very well. And this has to do with the fact that today producers have to pay for recycling at end of life, often in collective schemes. So the share of what they have to pay depends on the share of what is the market share they have with their new products. And then there's a certain organization, a certain body who collects and who provides the materials for recycling. But of course, the more they collect and the better recycling channels they use, which certainly are usually also a bit more expensive than not so good recycling channels, the higher gets the bill. Which means for this, for the producers, it's not really attractive to have comprehensive collection, and it's also not attractive to have very good recycling, because then the bill will be higher than if just a little bit is collected and recycling is not done so well. So I think that the key of new producer responsibility schemes need to be that there must be inherent incentives really to come to very comprehensive collection and to secure that this comprehensive collection is followed by high quality recycling. And from my point of view, the only way to get there is that we have to develop standards for collection, standards for recycling. These standards need to be mandatory. And then we also need audit systems and certification systems which verify that a producer, for example, behaves in the way he has to, that the collection really is comprehensive, that after collection really high quality recycling is used and not non-certified cheaper channels and so on. This is easier said than done, so it requires quite some efforts. I think the main actors in achieving this are, on the one side, again, the legislator. We have to change a little bit of the framework conditions, for example, setting standards, making them mandatory and so on. But of course, also the producers. And the good thing is that the whole topic of better recycling and circular economy and so on is nowadays pretty high on the political agenda. It's even part of the European Green Deal. There's a clear link also to climate change mitigation, competitiveness of the European industry, and so on. So I think it's important that all the participants in the value chain, and in this case specifically also the producer, they understand why this is important. And if they really understand why it's important, maybe even our MOOC helps a little bit to make this understandable, then that there also is an intrinsic motivation to set up something better than we have today. And in the end, of course, it also can have a very positive image factor, because in the long run, companies need to become more circular. Companies need to prove that they contribute to climate mitigation, and having good responsibility systems, really walking the talk in this area, can give you some nice hooks in your on your image scorecard.
Thanks. So, and going back to the consumer, one of our learners wanted to know, what do you think, how much are consumers actually willing to contribute to that? So how much would they be willing to pay, for example, for correct recycling?
That's an interesting question. And of course, I mean, I can ask it individually, because as you are a consumer, I'm a consumer for certain devices, so I can tell what I'm willing to pay. But of course, it's very difficult to give a general answer. Maybe it helps a bit, and then we have seen similar questions, similar debates, for example, around textiles. What is the difference between a responsible produced T-shirt, for example, and irresponsibly produced T-shirts? And often in the end price, it's only maybe 50 cents or maybe €1, so not very much. And actually, if you look into how much more expensive it would be to have really good end-of-life treatment of electronic devices, for example, it will not double the price. It's a small add-on on the price, and maybe it's important to educate a little bit more also about this. I mean, the people are willing to pay €1,000 and more for a new smartphone. So whether you pay €1,000 or if you pay €1,000 and plus 10, and the 10 then guarantees that there's a good recycling, and with €10 you can do a lot about improving collection and then high quality recycling. I think it would not really seriously hurt anybody, but really contribute to come to much more circular streams, and in the end also to fight climate change. So I think we have to develop maybe a narrative which tells a bit the story. And when I say we, it's we and the MOOC people, but certainly the better narrative would be if this comes from the producers, from the distributors, from the network providers, retail shops, and so on. And of course, again, policy has to play a role in building, supporting this, advertising for this, helping to distribute the story. So I hope this somehow has answered this not so easy question.
Then thanks a lot.